Hello and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep IAS. Before we begin today's discussion of the comprehensive news analysis, there are a couple of important announcements. First, Byju's IAS is bringing for you a very important workshop on 27th of March, 11 a.m. It's a 1 hour workshop where we will be discussing some of the common mistakes that candidates commit during the civil service examination preparation and while attempting the paper, and some of the common myths that are associated with this examination. The link to register for this workshop is given in the description of the video. Another announcement is that I will be taking a session tomorrow at 8 p.m. live on the YouTube channel of Byju's Exam Prep IAS, where we will be discussing in detail every aspect related to POSH, that is Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act of 2013. Do join in for that at 8 p.m. tomorrow. That will be a live session. Now let's begin our analysis for today. The first article that we are taking up is a good news from the Indian economy coming up. That is, the exports for the first time have crossed the $400 billion mark about 8 days before the financial year comes to an end. This was a target set by the Government of India at the beginning of the financial year, and the Prime Minister has congratulated multiple stakeholders on achievement of this target for the first time ever. However, in all this good news, there is also a negative news of concern that we should discuss. That is, despite our exports reaching the $400 billion mark, our imports are also increasing at the same pace. Meaning that despite an increase in the exports, our trade balance is still negative, which is a cause of concern for India as a country. The Prime Minister recently said that India set an ambitious target of $400 billion of goods export, and we have achieved this target for the first time ever. In fact, exports have increased as compared to the pre-pandemic level of $331 billion. Now, this will be a big boost to India's ongoing negotiations of free trade agreements with multiple nations across the world. Some of the sectors that mainly contributed to this increase in export were petroleum products, gems and jewelries, and also the agriculture sector that recorded its highest ever export during 2021-22, mainly with the export of rice, marine products, wheat, spices, and sugar. Now, the Prime Minister on his own Twitter account shared a few photos yesterday, and I'm giving you a screenshot of those photos. These photos tell us how the goods export for India averaged $33 billion every month for this financial year. Every single hour, India exported goods worth $46 million, and every single day, we average an export of over $1 billion, which is a good sign for the Indian economy in the coming days. Not just this, if you compare it with India's exports of 2020-21, you will see that it has seen more than 1/3 of an increase. So there's a 37% increase in India's total exports as compared to the last financial year. Just to give you an idea, what are the commodities that India usually exports? Now, bear in mind that these export commodities that I'm showing you are from the previous financial year. So they are from the financial year of 2020-21. But it will give you a fair bit of idea about what are the commodities that India mainly exports. So we mainly export mineral fuel, oil, distillation products, pearls, etc. Now, there are a few things that you must understand about these first two entries. First, India exports a lot of mineral fuels and oil. Now, it would be interesting for you to understand India is not really a big producer of crude oil. So how do we export a lot of oil and mineral fuel? That is because India has some of the world's largest oil refineries. For example, the Reliance Oil Refinery at Jamnagar is the world's largest oil refinery. So what India does as a whole is we import a lot of crude oil. We purify that oil, we refine that oil. It is used in India also. And then the refined oil and the byproducts of that crude oil, the distillation products, etc., are sold in the outside market. So India is importing crude oil, and then what we are exporting are the refined products. That is why at the first place, we usually have export of mineral fuels, oils, etc. Similarly, pearls. Now, India does not really produce a lot of diamonds and precious stones, etc. But what we do have is that we have a big diamond polishing industry in many parts of Gujarat, such as Surat. So what India does is we import a lot of raw diamonds, raw pearls, precious stones, then we process it to give it their best possible form, and then we export the same to the outside world. So both the first and the second export that we have are actually dependent on India importing crude things, importing unrefined things, and then refining them, giving them their best possible form, and then exporting it. In other words, in order to export these two, we must first focus on importing these. So our import in these two can never be lesser than what our export is. Now, as I said earlier, also in the beginning of the article, that while our export is increasing at a good pace, the concern for India still is an unfavorable trade balance. For instance, our exports from April 2021 to December 2021 were over $300 billion, which are about 49.7% increase as compared to the previous year. And these two exports were mainly made up of the things that we just discussed. That is, petroleum products, gems, jewelries were the ones that were the main contributors to this. Now, this is not just with India. Across the world, as per the data given by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, there has been a global increase in people buying stuff and consuming more things. For example, the global merchandise trade across the world has hit a record high of $5.6 trillion in the quarter 3 of 2021. Now, this has also got to do with something called revenge shopping. You might have heard this phrase, revenge shopping, revenge traveling. That means that because people across the world were locked up in their houses for 1 or 2 years during the COVID pandemic, now that they have gotten a chance to go outside, to shop for clothes, to go and travel, people are doing it much more as compared to what they used to do earlier. So because they were not able to buy any new clothes or shoes or new accessories for the past 1.5 year, now they're compensating for that by buying extra things which they don't even need. And that is why we have seen a rise in the export of many nations across the world and not just India. Also, another factor that has worked in India's favor is that there has been another outbreak of COVID-19 infections in some countries such as Vietnam that have been a key competitor to India when it comes to export of merchandise, etc. And that's why, because the supply chain has disrupted from that end, it has allowed India to fill in that space. India's service exports have also grown by about 18.4% to reach about $177.7 billion in the first 9 months of this fiscal year, means from April till December. But now coming to the negative part. That is, India's merchandise imports have grown even faster as compared to the export. Our import have increased by about 69% as compared to the last year when you look at the numbers for the first 9 months of this fiscal year. The key imports for India include petroleum and petroleum products, that is in the crude form, gold, electronic goods, etc. So yes, there is a positive sign for India about increasing trade, but as I said earlier, the trade imbalance is still a cause of concern for India. The next article that we have is on a similar theme that we just discussed. The authors here, who are well-known economists, are pointing out that India's growth prospects in the coming 2 or 3 years do not really look good because of a lot of uncertainties at the global level. The main theme of this article is, number one, because of the increasing crude oil prices across the world, India's growth estimates would be cut down significantly. And it has started to happen with a number of international agencies cutting down the growth forecast that we had for India. Secondly, the authors are also pointing out that if you look at the numbers closely, the consumption pattern in India has not improved. Yes, our growth might be seen to be pretty good right now, but that is because of the lower base. Lower base because we had such a large dip during the pandemic year that now any growth that we show seemed like a big improvement. But now that that effect of low base has gone, the number that we see in our growth will not be very high as per these economists. So the authors here are saying that in 2020-21, both the real GDP and the gross added value contracted by 6.6 and 4.8% respectively. In fact, Government of India's own data shows that the recovery that we are expecting will not be very high, because 8.9 and 8.3 might seem like a very big number in growth, but when you compare it with the low base that we have created because of the pandemic decline, it is not really something that's a positive sign for the economy. Because despite this improvement, if you compare a real GDP with the GDP of 2019-20, means the pre-pandemic era, the growth is very, very minimal. That is, the private consumption expenditure is just about 1.2% higher, while the gross fixed capital formation is just about 2.6% higher. Means the consumption and the growth in the economy as compared to pre-pandemic levels is still not very high. And in the view of the authors, due to the global uncertainties, the situation can become even worse, mainly because it is leading to a disruption in the supply chain of crude oil and an increase in prices in the crude oil across the world. There have been multiple reports by international organizations and the RBI also that have drawn a connection between the increasing crude oil prices at the global level and a decline in India's GDP growth. For instance, the report suggests that the surge in the crude oil prices will lead to a reduction in India's real GDP by 0.27% and an increase in the retail inflation by 0.4% at least. In fact, an increase of $25 per barrel price could lead to a growth reduced by 0.7% and increase in inflation of 1%. Now, do understand, we are only talking about a $25 per barrel increase as compared to our average assumption of $75 per barrel that we calculated at the time of the budget. However, at present in the global market, the oil prices are hovering close to $120 per barrel. So even assuming $25 per barrel increase from $75 level would lead India to a cut of growth by 0.7%. Even higher prices means even lower growth and even higher inflation in the Indian market. So we have to be ready for that as well. And an increase in the crude oil prices does not just mean an increase in the price of diesel and petrol. It also means that other components which are drawn out from the crude oil, such as fertilizers, etc., their prices will also increase, meaning that the government would now have to spend even more money if they want to give fertilizer subsidies to the farmers, which they would not want to disrupt because the farmers are in need of the government support anyway. Means from all the sectors there are negative signs coming in for the government, and the government will have to be extremely smart about how does it spend the limited money that it is earning right now. The one positive sign for India can be that India does not have large trade relations with Russia or Ukraine. So although there are discontinuations in the SWIFT banking transactions, it won't affect India that much because our imports and exports are very limited from these nations, and we can certainly find certain substitutes in the international market. Now, what does the government do? There are not many options available with the government right now. Already we have seen that for the past 2 days, the oil prices have increased across the country, and it has already become a matter of discussion in the parliament with the opposition members raising this issue time and time again. Now, maybe the state and the central governments can reduce their excise duty or the VAT, but would it really be helpful or not? It might decrease the prices for the end consumer, but at the end of the day, lesser excise duty, lesser VAT means lesser money in the hands of the government, means lesser expenditure done by the government. So eventually it will hurt the capital expenditure, it will hurt the other government schemes that are on the way. So these are difficult times, and the government must be extremely wise on how and what does it want to prioritize while spending money that it is earning. Now, as I said earlier, just a few days back, we have seen that multiple international agencies have been cutting down on India's growth forecast. For example, Fitch recently cut down India's growth forecast for the next fiscal to 8.5%. You can get different perspectives about India's growth with different sources. So I'll give you a couple of sources to make you understand how India's growth story is being seen by other people across the world. This snippet I have taken from the official website of OECD, where they have a page specifically dedicated to India and India's growth, where they are comparing India's economy, environment, and inequality with the OECD nations. The OECD group, as you know, has some of the most developed nations across the world. In terms of economy, India's GDP per capita is 86% lower as compared to the OECD best performers. Not just this, in terms of inequality also, India does not fare very well. For instance, poorest 20% of households in India earn only 4.1% of the total income, and that is why India's inequality is much higher as compared to some of the most advanced nations in the world. Similarly, about 75% of population in India is exposed to harmful levels of air pollution. The only good thing from this entire story is that India's per capita greenhouse gas emission is still extremely low as compared to the developed nations across the world. Now, this is not to make you feel bad, but this is just to give you a comparison of where does India stand as compared to developed or the advanced countries throughout the world. How our employment rate are extremely low as compared to developed nations, how our productivity per employee is much lower, how our income inequality is higher, and how all these are aspects on which the government of India needs to work. There's another report given by Deloitte, which is again a big consulting company, that has talked about how India can grow or has been growing after the pandemic. This is a graph to show how India's private consumption, government consumption, and total fixed investment has varied from quarter to quarter. As you can see, the first quarter of 2021 was a time when India saw the biggest decline in its growth story ever. Now, if you see the graph after that, just notice this growth in the first quarter of 2022. Now, you might see that it is a big growth that we have seen, but if you compare it with the decline that we already had, that means that we are still just getting back to the pre-pandemic level rather than actually growing at a very fast pace. One other cause of concern, which the authors also pointed out, was the private consumption. Private consumption means how much money are you spending for consuming things in day to day life: clothes, food, going out, going on a holiday, buying new things, etc. That is indicated by the blue bar here. As you see, this blue bar is not very high, and that is also a cause of concern because unless you spend money, that will not really help the market. Let's take a very simple example. You might have 100 crore rupees with you, but if you are not spending that money to, let's say, buy a car or buy a flat or buy a new business, that will not really help the economy. Because when you spend money to buy a car, that means that money will now go to the car manufacturer, that money will go to people working for the car company, the manager, the receptionist, etc. Those people will again go ahead and buy certain fruits, vegetables, they will travel, and that is how an economy works. If you just keep all the money in your hand, think that I will not spend it, that will be very detrimental to the economy. For any economy to flourish, there should be free flow of capital rather than just preserving the capital in one or two hands. That is why the private consumption has to increase so that the money keeps flowing from one hand to the other hand, which is not happening right now in India. The next article focuses on how exactly did China did the unthinkable. During the pandemic lockdown, when almost every country across the world was seeing a decline in the growth, almost every country had a negative impact on their GDP, China was a standout country. Even in the pandemic year, China's economy actually grew as compared to the last year. In fact, in 2020, China's manufacturing output was about $3.8 trillion, which is in fact more than India's entire GDP. Not just this, since then, China's GDP, China's industrial production, all have been showing a positive growth, which no country around the world has been able to do. Now, what are the hidden secrets that China has been able to do this, where no country around the world, big or small, has been able to handle the pandemic in a way that China did? Also, it is even more interesting to note because the pandemic actually started in China, and China was the first country to impose such a strict lockdown that they did not even allow anyone to step out on the roads. Then how was it possible that China is in such a situation right now? The one single answer, as per the author, to this question is the use of AI, that is artificial intelligence. As per the author, what China is doing is they are becoming a world leader in using AI, that is artificial intelligence, that is making their businesses and their manufacturing so much more efficient as compared to the other countries that it is becoming almost impossible to catch up with China right now. If you remember, when the pandemic had hit, there was a big debate around the world that the entire world is fed up of China because they hid a lot of facts about coronavirus, they did not share information with the world, and as a result, there was an expectation that many companies will now shift out of China. In fact, there were many articles written that the companies might come to India, might come to other developing nations across the world. But has it happened on the ground or not? The reality is not really. There was an expectation that the $4 trillion worth of manufacturing that China has would now be dispersed to other locations, but that has not happened. In fact, China accounts for 30% of the world's manufacturing alone. Even if a part of it would have transferred to countries such as India, That would have made a big difference to our economy and would have dented China's GDP. But that has not happened. There were just a couple of quarters in between where China's growth story took a hit, but even then, China has been able to recover much better as compared to any other country. One of the key reasons behind that was, as President Xi Jinping said, that China is now focusing on dual circulation, internal and external. What he meant was internal circulation means China is reinventing its own manufacturing units. They are not just sitting back and using the old technology, they are using new technology, and they are giving a push to private consumption within their country. Secondly, external circulation means now China is entering into new sectors of manufacturing. See, when you talk about Chinese manufacturing, the USP of China while manufacturing was that they used to produce the stuff at the cheapest cost possible. So they were extremely cost effective. You never went to China because you would find the best technology, because we knew that we would find the cheapest products. If I tell you which country has the best technology, you might point towards US, Japan, Germany, etc. But if I tell you what is the most cost effective nation, then maybe you would point towards China. China now is actually turning a leaf over that. What China is doing is they are now entering other markets where not just cost matters, but technology also matters. And how are they doing it? By adopting artificial intelligence. China now is not just focused on producing the cheapest stuff. They are focusing on producing stuff that is not seen anywhere across the world, which has the best form of technology. That is what they mean by dual circulation. Over the years, the reason why China has been able to produce the cheapest stuff was that Chinese had such kind of laws that they paid very low wages to their workers under very strict conditions. The workers could not demand higher wages because those were the laws in China, and it allowed the companies in China to produce stuff at a much lower cost. Now, what has happened is in the past decade or so, with increasing aspirations of the people, with young people joining the workforce, people in China are now demanding much higher wages. So China now cannot produce the same stuff at such low cost as it used to do earlier, because now they would have to pay more money to the people. That is why now companies are not depending on people. Chinese companies are now adopting AI, artificial intelligence, rather than focusing on the wages that the workers are demanding. And this Chinese push towards AI is not new. In fact, China has now gained a significant lead over the rest of the world in terms of filing patents in AI applications, and had already overtaken the US in 2014. There are a lot more inventions happening in the field of AI in China as compared to even the Western nations, including the US. And a lot of articles have been written about it in the international media. There are two major takeaways by adopting AI. Number one, in the long run, it would help China reduce its cost, and thus its products will be even more cost effective. Secondly, it will be able to enter those fields where technology matters more as compared to cost efficiency. So this is a big play that China has been aiming for the past decade or so. Now, let me share with you some examples of how China has used AI in the past couple of years or so. In Jan 2020 itself, when many countries across the world, including India, were not taking the COVID disease very seriously, Chinese companies had already started developing AI solutions to refine their systems and fight the new disease. In fact, they started developing doctor chatbots. Means if you had any medical emergency, you can just open up a chat and the chat box will reply to you instantly by interpreting your message without the need of any doctor. In fact, China's rural communities were also connected with the healthcare professionals with these AI solutions as back as in the beginning of 2020. There were also inventions of new robotics, human computer interaction, medical images. All of that was done by China when the world was just struggling to develop masks and hand sanitizers. Many companies also tried to minimize the exposure to the virus by developing robots and ensure disinfection services, temperature screening, etc., without any human to human interaction. In fact, as per the Stanford University's AI Index report of 2021, China had the largest share of publications in the Artificial Intelligence Journal in 2019, followed by US, European Union, Japan, etc. Thus, tomorrow, if you see in the newspaper all of a sudden that China has invented a big thing in the AI field, don't be surprised, because they have been working on it in the background for over a decade now. Also, just a side note, as I said earlier, One of the reasons that manufacturing companies have again gone back to China include another outbreak that we are seeing in countries such as Vietnam, etc. For all the criticism that you want to make of China, the fact remains that they are the country that have been able to control COVID most effectively, be it by imposing the strictest of the lockdowns, be it by punishing people. But the fact remains that COVID was first effectively controlled in China only. The next article here is an interesting read which actually talks about the Russian history. The author here, who is a historian, says that if you read about Russian history, you will never be surprised about what Vladimir Putin is doing. Historically, if you look at history of the past 500 years, you would notice that whenever a Russian leader is under pressure from outside world or from its own people, the way that they react is not by talking to people, not by signing treaties, but by trying to attack some other country, gain new territory, and pacify the people. This has always been the modus operandi of all the Russian leaders in the past 500 years, except two, that is, Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev. If you ignore these two, every single leader that Russia has had, we have seen that all these leaders have just tried to invade another country or occupy new positions whenever they have been under pressure. Peace talks have never been at the top of the mind, and Vladimir Putin is no different. Historically, when Russia was ruled by the Tsars, Ukraine used to be a part of Russia. Russia now, under Vladimir Putin, wants to go back to the same era of about 400 years ago because they still see Ukraine as their own country. In fact, the Russian government recently had said that they don't see Ukraine being an independent country because Ukraine as an independent country was always a mistake and we want to rectify that. So there is nothing new that Russia or the Russian leaders are doing right now. Be it the famous Russian leader Peter the Great or be it the famous Russian Queen Catherine, all of these leaders have tried to expand towards the West due to various reasons. The first reason is that although Russia has such a big landmass, they don't have access to a freshwater port. They have access to the Arctic Circle, but it is so frozen that no trade can go through it. So they don't have access to a freshwater port, and that is why they have been trying to expand towards the West in the last few centuries. Russia has always been trying to gain access to the Black Sea and to the Baltic Sea to ensure that their maritime trade is never affected. This also is one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin has invaded Ukraine. And I'll show you a map to make you understand what are the intentions of the Russian invasion right now. You would have read multiple times that history repeats itself and what is happening in Russia is no different. In fact, if you look at Russia's war with Japan, the famous war of 1905, one of the reasons why Russia actually went on a war with Japan was that the Tsar at that time was under a lot of pressure internally. There was a lot of corruption, a lot of poverty in the country, and the Tsar thought that if we acquire new territories from this very small nation called Japan, maybe the people of Russia will be happy and they will forget all about that. Little did he know that when he went to war with Japan, this small country, Japan actually defeated Russia. So not that it has always been a good strategy, but this strategy has been employed by many czars or rulers of Russia in the past as well, whenever they have been under any sort of pressure. And Vladimir Putin is following the same pattern as many others before him have done in Russia. And that is why this expansion of Russia towards the West is not the last time it is happening. There will be no surprise if other nations are also attacked in the future, especially the ones which are along the Baltic and the Black Sea, because Russia sees it as its own right to capture these freshwater bodies. Now, you would have been reading in the news in the past week or so. There is one place in Ukraine that is a Mariupol port that has been in the news quite a lot. The reason is that the Russian forces are focusing their entire attack on Mariupol. This city has been extremely devastated. All the infrastructure in this city has fallen down. In fact, Russia has appealed that the Ukrainian people fighting in this city must surrender if they want to be safe and if they want to be alive. Now, the interesting part is if we look at this city, this is not a big city, but it is extremely important to understand what is the significance of this city. As you can see, Mariupol here has two major significance. Number one, it gives a connectivity to Russia with the Crimea region. The Crimea region, as you remember, is a region that was annexed by Russia in 2014. So this region already has a lot of forces that are from Russia. Secondly, This gives a freshwater port to the Donetsk and the Luhansk region. These are the provinces in the Donbass region that have been recognized by Russia as independent sovereign nations. And Russia, in fact, right now has a lot of influence over these regions. These regions are controlled by groups which are supported by Russia right now. So if Mariupol becomes a part of the Russian Empire, or if Mariupol is controlled by Russians, that means that the Donbass region will now have access to this freshwater port of Mariupol, and Russia can now use it for all the trading activities that they want to do. That is why the fight now is focused on the Mariupol region. There are some key reasons why Russia and Vladimir Putin is focusing on Mariupol only. Number one, it will give them a land corridor between Crimea and Donbass. As I said, if Mariupol becomes a part of Russian controlled territory, that means that over 80% of Ukraine's Black Sea coastline will now be controlled by Russia, meaning that Ukraine's maritime trade will be affected and they will not be able to contact with the outside world because this area will be under the Russian control. Secondly, Mariupol is a very important port since it is very deep and is the biggest port in the Azov Sea region, and that is why it is a home of major iron and steel works. It is mainly an export hub for steel from Ukraine, iron, coal, and even agriculture products such as corn. If this port is under control of Russia, that means that the Ukrainian economy will start to cripple very soon. Another very interesting reason here is that if you remember when the war had started, Vladimir Putin had made a statement saying that he wants to get rid of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. He was pointing towards the fact that in Ukraine there are the neo-Nazis, means people who were supporting the Nazis in the Germany at the time of the World War II, and he wants to get rid of them. Now this is also connected with Mariupol somewhere. Try to understand this. Mariupol is the base of a unit of Ukrainian military called the Azov Brigade. Now, Azov Brigade mainly are those people who are far-right extremists. Far-right extremists means those who have been known to be indulging in violence, who have been extremely nationalist, and historically, the people of this Azov Brigade has had some ties with Hitler's Nazi party at the time of the World War II. They are the ones who are actually being called as the neo-Nazis by Russia. Not that they are killing any people, but just that their historical connection with the Nazi party is what is interesting here, and Vladimir Putin is trying to publicize this fact that I am attacking Ukraine because I want to safeguard the people of Russian origin in Ukraine. Otherwise, these neo-Nazis will kill many more Russian people in Ukraine, and that is why he's justifying his attack. So capturing Mariupol will give him that opportunity also, where he will be able to show the world that, see, now I have captured the neo-Nazis. All these are the reasons because of which Vladimir Putin and Russia are now focusing on the Mariupol city. These were the articles we wanted to discuss on the Hindu newspaper today. Now a couple of practice questions. Number one, despite the surge in merchandise exports, India's balance of trade still remains negative. Identify the hurdles being faced in turning around India's balance of trade. Second, it is time for India to focus on artificial intelligence if we want to remain in race for becoming a superpower. Discuss. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.